really excited to have Jake and Kelly here from Swapstack. Jake is the co-founder of Swapstack, and Kelly is a designer developer at Swapstack. And the goal of this event is to talk about not just Swapstack, but building a business with no code, centered around Swapstack, but just the general idea of how do we actually take our no code skills and turn that into building a successful business, which is, I think, one of the things that is kind of a gap where people might learn these skills, but then really struggle to turn that into something that people want, or that kind of all the things that go along with starting a business with that. So to one thing that I want to say before we get started as well is, if you have questions in the Q&A tab on the right side of the page, feel free to drop in your questions anytime throughout this session. And then in the last 15 minutes, we will answer questions from the audience. So make sure if any questions come up, feel free to shoot it in the Q&A. If it's more of a comment, feel free to put it in the live chat as well. So feel free to take advantage of those as we get going. So to get started, I'd love to just start with some background from Jake and Kelly, whoever wants to go first, and maybe just like a short background of how did you, maybe get started in tech, and then get started in no code, and get to kind of where you are right now building a business without code.
Kelly, you want me to go first? Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Jake. And Seth, thanks for organizing this event. This is super cool, and well done building Conference Stop. It's really awesome. I got started in tech, I guess 8 or so years ago. I had gone to grad school for business in New York, and my first job out of grad school was at Amazon in Seattle. I spent about 5 years there as a product manager. So that was a really great introduction into sort of like how tech products get built, how to think about roadmaps and goals, and sort of like how to satisfy customer needs in a few different areas of the company. And yeah, really interesting experience, learned a ton, good, bad, ugly, everything in between. One of the reasons I left was because I got some, as a product manager, you're involved with building products, but you're not actually building them. And so you have influence over what the engineers are building, over what the organization does, and all of these things, but you're not actually executing most of those things. And so one of the things I wanted to learn how to do leaving Amazon was how to build stuff myself. I had this vague idea, maybe I'd start my own startup, but it was a lot, looser than that. It was just getting, involved in nitty gritty, expressing creativity, things like that. And so when, I left Amazon shortly before the pandemic started, and the first exposure I had to Bubble was actually with Seth and I, who we worked on a project together at the very beginning of COVID. We had this idea, and we were kind of experimenting with different things, and I had heard about Bubble, and we got our first exposure there, learning how to build things there. But that was sort of the very beginning of my no-code journey, and then eventually later that year, through a bunch of other experiences, had the idea for Swapstack and met a co-founder, Jake, who I believe is here. And eventually, went deeper into it, learned a lot more about Bubble, and decided to lean all the way in for Swapstack. So that's how I got involved.
My turn. It's my turn. So I started out in nonprofits a while back, doing organizational stuff, operations and systems, database management, things like that. And over the course of my time in small nonprofits, I picked up some design skills, and ended up sort of shifting out of my operations role into just full-time design as a freelancer, and started building websites. So I was working in WordPress and then eventually Webflow, but I always really missed the sort of like clean nature of data, and how like it's not subjective. Like nobody gets to be like, make that number bigger, because the number is what it is. But design is just like kind of very tricky to work with clients and stuff. So I don't know how I found Bubble on Twitter, I'm sure. And I just figured, well, I'll try it out. I don't know. I'll just see what this thing is. And immediately was like, oh my God, it's the best thing in the world. It's so great. You can build anything. And I had an idea for a piece of software that I thought should exist. And so I started building it. Just, I was obsessed. I couldn't not build it, and ended up doing some sort of, I did 100 days of no code, and then I did On Deck no code fellowship, and just was like, okay, this is what I'm doing now. And so I started freelancing a couple of years ago, about a year and a half ago. And then old Jake found me somehow, I think through On Deck, because you guys were affiliated with On Deck at one point, and convinced me to come to Swapstack. So here I am now, using all my skills in one place. Yeah.
I actually think it was a cold Twitter DM, and you are just friendly.
Was it?
So you responded, and then we chatted, and I'm pretty sure. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. I'm impressed with myself. Good job, me.
That's awesome. And I think also, Kelly, like having your background in design is such a great skill set to have going into no code. I think there's a lot of people who start the other way around, and then it's a lot more challenging to build something that's really usable. I think like a lot of times with no code, and that's, I think, a very important part for the business side of things, of going beyond just like the basic MVP, of really making it, or that people can use.
Is a huge advantage. I mean, just massive. Like as a designer, I was always like a good enough designer. Like I wasn't amazing. I wasn't crap, but like I wasn't going to win any awards. But in the bubble world, man, it's hard to compete with someone just on sort of like even getting clients if you want to, freelance, or, building a product. If you don't have design skills, it's just really hard. It's just very difficult. So.
Totally. So I think a good place to go from here might be, Jake, I'm curious on your side, when you were starting Swapstack, were there any other no-code tools that you were thinking of building it with? Were you thinking of using code? How was that process? And then, how did it go from there?
Yeah, sure. And I just saw in the chat, Felipe said he couldn't hear me. I just want to make sure that the audio is coming through. Okay.
I can hear you.
You guys are good? Okay. If anybody else has problems, I guess put it in the chat. So question was around getting started. Was I considering other no-code tools or tools in general? So one thing I didn't mention in the intro was, before I found Bubble, I had spent a while teaching, learning how to code and taking a bunch of courses online and learning various different aspects of coding and building websites and apps. And I loved it. It was just so exciting. But it's obviously like very challenging, and there's so much there, and it can take years to like be able to build, I'd say, like professional quality things. Not that each project takes years, but just to get to the skill level of being able to do that. And so, when we started Swapstack, I had this background of learning how to code, but I was not yet at that level where I could, really feel like I was a professional developer. I'd say I was like on that journey, I suppose. So I, was considering using code, mainly because I wanted to keep learning how to get better at coding. Jake is my co-founder. When Jake and I were chatting about all of this, at some point I had to admit, like, okay, I'm probably not the right person. If we're going to build this in code, it probably should not be me, even though it was something personally I wanted to do. So that was sort of like on the code side. On the no code side, we could talk a little bit more about this. I think we will, about how we sort of started Swapstack, validated some of the ideas, and so on. It didn't start off in Bubble. It started off, I guess we started with lighter weight tools in order to validate some of the problems we wanted to solve. And so at a certain point, when we grew out of that phase of validating, it was mainly like Airtable and some automations and a bunch of emails, basically. That was when we had to decide, okay, do we need to build a real product here? How do we do this? And so we were having that code versus no code conversation. Once we ruled out code for all the reasons I talked about, Bubble, I think we were looking at, there was one other one called ShareTribe, which is a marketplace tool that, Seth, I think you know really well. I don't know it that well. And it was tempting. I mean, it felt like you could get something up much faster because it was, there was a structure there for marketplaces. In the end, though, we went with Bubble mainly because I just had a lot of familiarity with it, and I was pretty convinced that it could do what we wanted to do, or do anything that we wanted to do. And I think, yeah, we started Swapstack. I mean, we haven't even talked about what Swapstack is, but we started Swapstack as pretty much a pure marketplace, but it has really evolved a lot since then. So I think it was certainly the right choice, right, to build something on a much more flexible tool where we can take the product in whatever direction we felt like our users needed us to take it.
Cool. Yeah, that totally makes sense. And yeah, it's probably a good point. I can try and give a quick explanation of Swapstack and let me know if you think it's accurate.
Sure. I mean, you're a user, so
yeah,
you
totally.
should know.
I use it on both sides, actually.
Yeah.
Or really more as a advertiser. But so yeah, Swapstack is a marketplace that connects publishers who have newsletters with advertisers and makes it easier for those two to connect and sell ads in their newsletter. And that could happen in a variety of different ways. So there's multiple different, I know, channels that you're kind of going after to make that happen. But as a high level, that's what I would say. Anything you would add to that?
No, I think that's pretty much right. Yeah, it definitely covers the basics.
Cool. And I think you also made an interesting point about, starting from tools that were kind of hacked together to kind of validate, and then going to different tools. You thought about ShareTribe and then ended up with Bubble, which is also a similar path that I went with No Code MBA itself, where I started with, Webflow and MemberStack, and that worked pretty well. And then now the No Code MBA platform behind, once you log in, is all in Bubble. I think all roads lead to Bubble eventually, because as you kind of scale up and you want to build out more and more features, I think other no-code tools are really, really great for validating the business, which we should talk about in a minute. But once you kind of get beyond that point and you want to start scaling it up and building more features, that's where I think a tool like Bubble can really come in and allow you to really build something more scalable. But you don't have to start with Bubble. You can start with these other tools that are a lot easier. I think moving over to Kelly for a second, I'm curious. Something that I think comes up a lot when you're building in Bubble or building in a new industry that some people might think about, like, hey, I want to use code because there's a lot of talent out there already, and I can hire people that are already have these skills. How has that been? Building out a team, working with others, with a company that's built with Bubble. Is that a challenge? Are there any benefits to that? Maybe as a newer kind of technology? I think that would be interesting to hear about.
You mean versus code? Or
I guess versus code, or just, if you're building as, a developer building in Bubble, as you think about, bringing on other people who also know Bubble, or like, where do you find those developers?
Oh my God.
How has that been?
Yeah, I mean, so it's been just Jake and I for the past year. And we sort of, for a minute, talked about bringing someone else on. And then kind of were like, well, let's just hold on for a minute. And so we haven't had to do that at this point. I mean, we've had a couple of other developers come in sort of for short-term contracts, right? Mm-hmm. I think that, and Jake could probably speak to it a little bit more, but from my perspective, just kind of like the Bubble developers that I know and I'm aware of, they're so busy. If you're, any good at all, you've got work. You don't need work. And so it's really hard to find someone who is not only available and that you can afford, but also who is good. And I think the biggest challenge for finding a Bubble developer is how do you know they're any good? Mm-hmm. I mean, I can make an app that looks pretty, but what if the data structure is just terrible, right? And I think probably when Jake hired me, my skills were, well, I know this for sure. My skills were nothing near what they are now, because I was learning on my own. And I don't have a coding background other than HTML, CSS, right? Visual stuff. So I didn't know anything about database structure in this way. And so I think it's just really hard to gauge someone's skills, especially if you are not a builder yourself. Like if you're going to hire someone to build your app in Bubble and you don't know Bubble, I just think that's a massive mistake. You should learn Bubble, at least to a basic degree, so you can like ask them questions, that make sense and understand their answers, and just vet them. But I think, the market is like, there are a lot of Bubble developers, and there's a ton overseas. There's so many in Nigeria. There's just like Bubble developers everywhere. But there's not like a structure for certification yet. And so it's just hard to find someone. Yeah, I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What's your question?
No, that's a good point also about, I think if you're hiring someone, and it would apply to coding as well, like really, it's very hard to hire. It's really anything, I think, design, just about anything. If you don't have a basic understanding of how it works, it's going to be very hard to, hire that person. Totally.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people come to Bubble as entrepreneurs. I came to it as like, I wanted to freelance. I wanted to work for other people. And so I wanted to learn the tool really deeply and like thoroughly. But I think a lot of people come to Bubble wanting to build their own idea, and they just want to get it, the basics. They want to get enough knowledge to build their thing. And then they end up, their thing doesn't actually work. Like, they don't make any money off of it. So then they start freelancing in Bubble, but their knowledge isn't deep yet. Do you know what I mean? It's still very sort of shallow. And so you can like really build a very tenuous app with that level of knowledge. But because you've been building in it, like you're on the market, like people can hire you and they'll pay. And I will say, I didn't know my skills were subpar when Jake hired me. I had no idea. I always thought I was doing great. And then got in there and realized like, oh man, this guy knows so much more than me. This app was really complicated. And luckily he's very patient and I'm willing to learn, but yeah, it was hard coming in.
Yeah. And I think that's also one takeaway there for anyone listening is you probably, if you want to make money freelancing or get a job, learning Bubble is a great avenue.
Oh man, nothing better. Yeah. So much work.
Yeah, totally. Cool. So Jake, circling back to something we were talking about earlier about validating the business, which I think is something a lot of people here are probably going to be interested in, kind of going from that no code skill set to, okay, getting those first 10 customers or, 20 customers that are actually paying you, validating. What was your process with Swapstack and what were the tools before Bubble that you were using for that?
Sure. And I would love to also add stuff about hiring and team stuff, but I can answer this one
first.
Okay, so validating. So Swapstack, as Seth mentioned, is essentially designed to help email newsletter publishers find sponsorships. And essentially when we started, Jake and I both had our own newsletter, and we both were kind of learning about the industry, meeting a lot of other newsletter writers. And so, well, I guess I'll take a quick step back. I think the first step is like choosing a problem wisely, like something something you actually have some ideas about. And so in our case, it was something we were both in real time gaining experience with and meeting a lot of other people who were kind of playing in the same space. So I had a newsletter where my subscriber base was starting to grow, and I was starting to think about sponsorships and looked at the tools that were out there and thought they didn't seem great, or they weren't serving folks like me, and that just felt like there was an opportunity there. And so that was kind of how I came to this idea, and that's like a good starting point, right? Just have like a theory about what is the thing or what is the problem and the opportunity that you can address. I think maybe it sounds obvious, but I think it's still important to say. So there's that. Then when we started talking about sort of like validating it, what do we build? How do we solve it? All those things. Validating really was the focus in the early days. So the question there basically is like, how many newsletter writers really are there who are going to be looking for tools like this or are looking for tools like this? And also, can we actually satisfy that need? Like, is it possible to broker matches in an efficient way? Is it possible to actually facilitate real deals? And so, of course, you can build a whole really nicely featured app for this, but you really don't need to in order to start answering those questions. What we did was basically we set up a Slack community. We started inviting everyone we were meeting like I was mentioning before, sort of just organically through various communities that we were parts of into the Slack community. And we were kind of like a variety of different ways going kind of door to door, like virtually, and trying to source advertisers who might be interested. Jake and I were both involved with On Deck at that point. And so we were meeting other people starting startups, and a lot of our early advertisers who gave it a shot in the first few months were other On Deck startups who were open to newsletters and learning all about the Substack thing that was going on and kind of just curious about it. So that was kind of just like, how do we find people? In terms of the tool that we built, we started really simply. We created basically just an Airtable database. And I didn't know that much about Airtable coming into that, but I was blown away by what you could do in Airtable. If anyone doesn't know, I assume your audience knows Airtable really well. But using forms to basically, anytime we would meet a publisher or an advertiser, we'd send them the form, and then that would just put them right into the database. And then you can essentially just make those tables public, and you can add buttons, and you can sort of just do the very basic feature set of like express interest in a thing, in a person, in a record on this table. And then if we were able to like basically we just created a very simple double opt-in intro system in Airtable, and then if both sides were interested, we just sent them an email basically and CC'd them both, and we're like, cool, like off you go, enjoy. And so that really was the first step. We weren't like capturing value, we were just trying to create value. Eventually we felt like there was enough. I wish I could say like we had a very specific number we were trying to hit, and once we hit that, we like felt like we validated it. It was a little more, I guess, like soft, like squishy than that, but there was enough interest and enough activity that we felt pretty good, just at least taking the next step. So the next step was like, okay, let's see if we can get them to actually come back at the end and use like some kind of payment system that we build, a very, very basic payment system, so that we could capture a fee and just see if we can like close the loop. We have like the introductions, we've got the payments. Maybe later we'll build the stuff in the middle, but for now, let's just do those two. And so we, I think that was when we started on Bubble, actually just building a very simple invoicing tool. So it was, using Stripe to just allow them to allow publishers to cut invoices to advertisers. We took a 10% fee, and that was pretty much it. It started like that. I think we were in that state for, I don't know, at least a couple of months, and just trying to see how much we can grow it like that. And then, a lot more since then, but I think that's generally the approach we took to validating it.
Cool. And I think something that kind of stands out to me is that you kind of kept doing the minimum amount you needed to validate. So you would build out the Slack community. Okay, that's working. Let's do the next step and do the next step. And okay, now we're going to build out payments. And I think that was a really smart way of going about it, and something that other people who want to validate and build with and I think that's also where no code comes in, is that you're able to build those, very minimal products and do it quickly and see if it's working, and then validate and kind of keep iterating from there.
Yeah, and I've gotten asked a few times over the last couple of years, like, okay, when did you like, at what point did you like check that box of like you validated it and then actually go and build the thing? And my answer is always the same. It's like, that has never happened. Like we're still doing exactly what you just said, even though now we're 2 years later and we have way more products built. At every step of the way, we're at least doing our very best to keep just building the most minimal version of whatever the thing is that we're focused on at that time. We have made mistakes. We have taken on way too big of projects at various points. We've learned from those mistakes. Kelly can talk about that at length. But we, like that is very important even now, because at the end of the day, we're still a tiny team, and we're, still, I would say we're still validating different pieces of the business. And so, every time we're talking about what we need to build, we try to figure out how can we keep this smaller, like how do we cut this or anything from it. So, I think it's important. Like, yes, it's important at the beginning, but I think it's also important to just always be doing that. At least, I don't know if you ever stop. We haven't stopped. I don't know if we plan to stop. Probably not. But I would say that's definitely critical.
Yeah, totally. And I don't think it really is amazing what you all have built with such a small team. And I think that is a testament to both your talent and no code as well. And most people probably wouldn't realize all of the things that go into a marketplace like Swapstack. It's not as simple as just connecting people. Marketplaces in general are kind of, I think, like sneakily complex, because there's so much that goes into kind of making everyone happy. so you guys raised money for Swapstack, and I think
Mhm.
one thing that people might be interested in is, when you were raising that money, was the fact that you were using no code something that was challenged by investors? Was that an issue, or was it not? Was that something that came up on your side?
It came up not as much as I thought it would come up, but it did come up. And maybe it's been about a year and a half since we raised or so memory might be a little bit shaky. So if Jake is listening still, he can correct me. But there was one specific investor who ended up not investing, mainly because he saw this as a risk. I'll just say that. And then aside from him, I think it almost never came up, which is really interesting. I don't know how much of that's because we raised a pre-seed round, relatively small amounts from, relatively and more like angel investors and friends and family, not only, but like it's skewed in that direction. And I assume, if we raise again from kind of bigger venture capital firms, that might change. I don't know. But yeah, so it did come up. It didn't come up as much as I maybe feared. I think we also, when we talked about it at that point, part of the thought was like, well, we for the first decent chunk of Swapstack, and maybe still, but probably less now, there was always this question of like, okay, when do we move on from Bubble? Or do we move on from Bubble? And so I think part of the pre-seed talk that Jake and I were having was like, well, maybe, if it really is an issue, like that can be part of the reason we're raising, right? So we can actually move off of Bubble. We just haven't, there have been times where we got close, but we haven't yet found a real reason to do it, where it like actually justifies the cost, where the ROI would make sense. And so I don't know when that may happen, if it will ever happen, but yeah, I think in the pre-seed that was part of the conversation too.
Got it. Cool. Yeah, that definitely makes sense. And there are lots of, I think it's becoming more and more common for no code companies like built on Bubble to raise money. You're seeing more examples of
Totally.
that, or if they haven't raised money, just, being really successful. And I think investors are also, as no code becomes more, common, more of them are kind of aware of the benefits of it, and I think that helps as well.
Yeah, at the end of the day, we can demonstrate like how fast we can move and how much we can do in such a short period of time. And I think that tends to win out over any like hesitations. Right. And if the concerns are about long-term scale, like that's fine, but we're not there yet. So
right.
We can figure that out later.
That's always if people are worried about is this going to scale to 1 million users, but it doesn't matter if you don't have
10,000 users, right? Exactly.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Kelly, on your side, Jake mentioned about some of the maybe projects that, and this maybe the larger question is prioritizing different features, and maybe there's some examples where you guys had too many features that you're trying to build or over prioritize. So if someone's building in Bubble, and I think this is also something that with no code becomes a challenge as well, because so much can be done, and you kind of in theory could do it, but it can kind of become too much. So how do you prioritize different projects, and are there some lessons learned from Swapstack there?
Yeah, we had this past year a huge project, basically rebuilding the core feature of the app, our marketplace, which is it was just the biggest project in the world, and I just sort of, I don't know, nearly lost myself in it. It was hard. It was really hard. And so basically, because I'm a designer, I'm going to start in Figma, and I'm like, okay, here's how I think we should like reframe this and, move this around. And what if we built this? And Figma is really easy to like build a chat feature, or like build a pop-up that does a thing. Like it's just moving pixels around. But in Bubble, you have to build the logic, you have to build this data. And so we together, and we talked to users and everything, and the whole team, we were like, great, this is what we're doing, right? We're going to build this. And we even planned out data structure and all that kind of stuff. And then when we started building it, it just ended up like a few weeks in, realized like, this is so big, it's going to take months. But we're already in too far, you know what I mean? And so we were like, do we keep going forward? Do we just scrap it and start over in smaller chunks? What do we do here? And we ended up just pushing forward, for better or worse. And we got it done. Like it's there now. People like it, it's fine, and I'm proud of it. But it was very difficult because it just took longer. It just took longer than we thought. You know what I mean? Even though it took probably a fraction of the time it would have taken if you had coded that. I think that with Bubble, you get used to being able to move really fast. And I was still learning the system. Do you know what I mean? I didn't build this platform. Jake did. So I had to learn, you know, and part of it, like Jake and I are different in that, like, Jake didn't need to document anything because in the beginning he was building by himself, and he, you know, he shouldn't have spent time documenting things. But then I came in and I was like, why don't I know everything immediately? You know? And so I just really struggled to tackle this massive project, and also need to understand how to not screw up what already existed. You know what I mean? And so, and I think, like, I don't know, Jake, you might be able to speak to this. Like, I know we were both really frustrated in that, and like lots of this happening, you know, and there was nothing to do about it, but like just quit or keep going. So now we sort of, you know, at the end of that project, we were like, I almost left Swapstack. I was almost just like, I'm not good at this. I don't know. I suck at this job. I'm sorry. And Jake was like, how about we just like maybe rethink how we're working? And so now everything is small bites, really tiny things. We work in cycles, 2-week cycles, and we really try to keep any project that we're working on that could fit within a cycle, right? And it might be a part of a larger, you know, project that is, you know, going to take months, but we try not to think about it that way. We're like, we're moving in this direction, but that's not a project. The project is build this one small feature, and then we tick that off, and then we move on to the next small feature, which is I hate that. I want the big thing, and I want like a big party at the end of the big thing. But I think with software development, it's just too messy for that. You know, I think you have to do small bites in order for it to really actually work.
Yeah, it's messy. There's so many lessons from that experience. I think the biggest one probably is that, like, it's not just because it took so long. I mean, that there was a whole cascade of problems that came from the fact that it took so long. But when you're in a startup or any fast moving environment, if you take on a project that takes 4 months, the industry, the company, your users, like from when you planned it to when you're shipping it, it's not the same thing. You're not working in the same industry anymore. You're not working on the same company anymore. And so we were basically in this position where we're like 3 months into this project, and we're like, man, this is not even like our top priority anymore, because a lot of things have shifted. And then what do you do about that, right? And like Kelly said, there were like no good choices. We just kind of, you know, I think it was probably the right choice to persevere, but like, who knows? It would have depended when we were, like, we probably had this conversation multiple times throughout this. Like, if the earlier we would have maybe called it, would have maybe been smart, but like by the time we got closer to the end, like definitely not. But yes, all that to say, like, you're always in a shifting environment. You always have to be responsive to what your users need and what your competitors are doing and what the industry demands. And so taking on big projects just doesn't allow for that at all.
Right. And what are some tactical ways that you and Kelly work together and collaborate together, maybe both from a, you know, Bubble perspective, like literally building in Bubble together? I don't know what kind of, you know, tools are around that, and then from a higher level communicating, and it sounds like you touched a little bit on that, but I think that could be really helpful.
Sure. Yeah, I'll talk about parts of it, and then Kelly can talk about other parts of it. But I mean, so Kelly mentioned linear. No, she didn't. She mentioned her cycles. We do 2-week like sprints or cycles, and we use a tool called Linear to manage all the work. And so Linear is kind of like a modern version of Jira. If anyone knows Jira, it's like meant for software development. I'm a huge fan. It's taken Kelly a little longer to come around, and to say the least. So yeah, I mean, basically in terms of like, what are we working on? How do we communicate about like where things are, how far we've gotten, how, you know, what are we planning on doing next? Like all of those sorts of conversations all happen in Linear. We used to try to do a daily stand-up where we would talk about all this stuff, and eventually decided that it was doing more harm than good. So we moved to basically, we we touch base at the, like right before a cycle starts. We touch base halfway through the cycle to make sure we're like, we know what's happening, and then we touch base at the end of every cycle. So we basically have three scheduled calls, I guess, per cycle, and then ad hoc as needed. If it's like, you know, one of us is working on a feature and just needs help on something, we'll just Slack each other and get on a quick call. So that's in terms of like planning and, you know, organizing, I guess, the actual things we're going to do. In terms of inside a bubble, maybe I'll let Kelly talk about that.
Yeah. Inside a bubble, we try to make use of the very weak documentation features they have, comments. That's kind of all they have. And it's not robust enough to really be all that useful, but you know, we try to use them. We use Notion to document, you know, what we've built. But I think one of the things that's really helped is that we end up kind of working on each other's projects some, so that we end up learning how it works, right? And that way we can fix stuff if one of us is out of the office. There's an emergency, which has happened. So, and I didn't know what to do. And poor Jake had to like leave the museum and come home and fix the thing. Yeah, I mean, so we work async almost entirely because I'm usually overseas, and so we don't overlap all that much in our workday. So we've gotten really good at sort of being very detailed in our questions, and very sort of like, this is how we ask a question in linear, and this is how, you know, I need an answer to the question, and then here's what we do when the question was answered. Like, we've kind of developed a communication style that's like structured, right? Which I think if we didn't have that, and if we weren't the kind of people who are like cool with that, it could be a problem. But it took us a while to land on that, you know. Yeah, a long time actually. And
we're still iterating on it too. I mean, like, yeah, I would just say that. Like, it's every cycle we're sort of like, okay, how did that go? Should we change anything? That kind of thing.
Yeah. But I think in the very beginning, me coming on, not having come from software, anything before, as a designer, I always worked on my own. No one ever worked with me. And so I was used to sort of like saying what systems we're going to use and how we're going to structure a project, and like what level of communication we have and all that kind of stuff. And I didn't have any of that. Now, you know, like Jake was always open to hearing stuff, but like the company needed things that, you know, I couldn't be like, nope. Right. Like, I needed to like work with you guys on what you needed. But also I needed to learn the platform. And so in the beginning, I needed to talk to Jake a lot, and Jake needed to know that I was understanding what was going on. So we had these daily calls, but like eventually we just didn't need them anymore. And they were just taking up time. We didn't need to spend, you know, so there was a shift, and we were able to kind of like say like, yeah, let's not just stick with the structures that we've built for the sake of like, this is how we do things, you know?
Yeah. I think that is an interesting take, like for anyone listening who's, you know, in a similar situation or thinking about, you know, joining a similar situation or creating a similar situation. I think there's one of the downsides of something like validate and take the most incremental steps you can is like something Kelly mentioned earlier, where like I was starting off building by myself. I didn't know if we were going to have a team ever, or if we were going to be a real company ever, or any of this stuff. And so I didn't, at the time, what I consider to be like waste my time documenting or like naming stuff nicely or like whatever. And so then when I went to hire people and Kelly came into the team, like that, how do you learn an app that somebody just built for a year and didn't waste time documenting or naming things nicely? Like, it's completely impossible. And so I give her a lot of credit. I mean, I've learned a lot also about like how to try to build things now in a way that's friendlier to new people. I still am not like, I think we kind of balance each other out to a certain extent. Like, I'm still just flying when I'm building something, and I'm now learning to slow down a little bit. But yeah, that is, I guess, one of the downsides. And I don't really think there's a good resolution there, other than like everyone's just got to like work together to figure it out.
Yeah, and I think you also have to just be realistic about it. Like, I think I came in with completely unrealistic expectations of what I was going to be able to do, and it's finally someone said to me like, Kelly, most dev teams, someone comes in, they're not productive at all for months. Mm-hmm. They're learning. and making mistakes and screwing things up and then fixing them, like that is what this is. And I was like, wait, what? Like all this time I had been beating myself up because I wasn't good enough at this to like just immediately understand what was going on. So I think I wish that someone had said that to me early on. I just wish I was aware of that. But also I think, it's really nice that Jake and I have balanced sort of values in terms of like, I'm going to name everything and I have a convention and well, not everything, but like most everything, and it helps me to know what's going on. And it actually helps Jake to know what's going on. And he doesn't really care about that so much, but I know that when someone new comes in, like it's going to be beneficial for the company for them to be able to figure things out just because of how they're named. That's such a simple thing that takes up time and it's annoying to do, but like it's valuable, So
how do you document in Notion? Because that's something, as currently I'm build things in Bubble on my own. I try and document things. This platform conference tab I built in Bubble for anyone who doesn't know. And I tried to document as much as I can, knowing that eventually there may be another developer coming on. But curious, what are some best practices that you all have found in terms of like the amount of detail that you put in or just what you do there?
Yeah. We don't go into a ton of detail. We'll do a lot of looms of like, this is how this is, flows, whatever. I map out user flows and data structure in Lucid app, which is like it's great for sort of planning that kind of stuff out. So I end up sort of like, linking that in Notion of like, here was what our intention was, right? But the thing is like, you're going to build on top of it. It's going to be sort of not accurate anymore, right? So there's that challenge. And I think that's probably true of any software development. But even just, understanding what the purpose was in the beginning can be really helpful. But also, adding comments really is useful, I find. But in Bubble, you have to date them. You have to say, this is when I wrote this comment. And otherwise, it's just a comment. Who knows? It could have been written the first day Jake opened Bubble and might not be accurate anymore. So, I don't know. Comments and right. I don't know. There's no best practices. I'm sorry.
You guys are innovating on this and what is the best way to do it. So I think we have about 15 minutes left. Let's switch gears now to the audience Q&A. So I see there are a bunch of questions that have been asked. Feel free to continue asking questions and make sure you upvote your favorite questions. So we'll try to get to as many questions as we can. I'm going to go ahead and start with one, and feel free, either Jake or Kelly, to take these. The first question is, were there any limitations because of using Bubble for this project and not I'm guessing, a code tool is the question. Yeah.
That's Jake. I don't know.
In the early days, I mean, Bubble has also come along quite a bit since 2 years ago. I mean, or when did we start Swapstack? Yeah, a little bit more than 2 years ago. So I remember. So I think one of them was just like you can move super fast in Bubble, but before the responsive engine was built, which was when we were building Bubble, like it wasn't that much faster to build like a really large page. And the way our app is structured is basically a single page application. And so we have 2 versions of it, one for each side. And there's just like thousands, tens of thousands of elements on each of these pages. And so like working in the old engine and like, you want to like inject a new group somewhere. It's like, okay, cool. Now it's going to take me 8 hours to move all the other elements around. Or like add padding one by one to things. Like, I don't remember all the details, but it was just so painful. So I think that was one limitation.
That's not an issue anymore.
No, now it's a huge advantage. It's extremely fast. I mean, maybe that would be at par with building on code, I guess, but I don't really know anymore. But trying to think what else we had. We definitely had like, I think the biggest thing was like, I guess one of the most common issues we ran into in the first year, and actually the summer we started, I had a different developer working on the team for that summer. So it was like my first experience kind of collaborating and working in different versions, right? We didn't talk about version control yet at all, but version control in Bubble is they know very well as a pain point. I know they're about to release a new version of version control, but we used to run into like merge problems all of the time. Since Kelly's been on the team, it has happened, but not quite as much. And so there were certain points where we'd like build a feature, go and try to ship it, and then like the whole app would just break, and it would just kind of feel like this is a deal breaker. This doesn't work anymore, and we need to get off of this platform. And I guess like that's one very specific example, but the broader category of things was just like dependency on some startup to like have a reliable tool that you can use for the rest of the time. And I would say most of the time, like I give the Bubble team a ton of credit. Most of the time that hasn't felt like a huge risk. There have been times where it has felt like more of a risk. But over time, that risk has felt like it's diminished. It is still a risk though, for sure. Like our app is completely dependent on the Bubble team deciding that they want to continue building Bubble. Whereas if you were building it on code, you wouldn't have to really think about that. And so that's at least in the early days how I thought about it. I don't know, Kelly, if you feel like there's anything now that it kind of feels somewhat unlimited in a certain way. Like I do think if we were building, this is the common answer you probably hear a lot of, like if we were building something super novel with some like super specialized technology, then maybe, but we're not in that position. So
yeah, I don't feel like
relatively straightforward.
Yeah, I mean, I think sort of the way that they let us see and use our data could be, easier with code, but we've figured out ways to work around that are annoying, but like it is what it is. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think the benefits outweigh any limitations that Bubble has.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah.
Cool. The next question is about how do you think about utilizing WordPress or Webflow to optimize your content and landing page for SEO? I'm not sure if you all use Webflow or I think you may not.
Now we do.
Oh, you do now. Okay, cool.
We actually went from code to Webflow.
Oh, awesome. Cool. So yeah, another good example there. And to optimize your content and landing page for SEO while using Bubble for development on a separate subdomain. Sounds like you think positively about that since you do it. Curious if there's any. I do that also for anyone, but yeah.
I'll let Kelly talk about the SEO part because there's a project that she's working on right now that's related to that. I don't know if that's.
I don't know anything about SEO. What are you talking about?
Yeah. When we started Swapstack, our first landing page was in Card. Speaking of like validating with other no-code tools, when we decided to actually build Swapstack, one of the things we needed to do was build a proper landing page. And I mentioned earlier, one of the things other Jake and I were talking about was I still wanted to like keep leaning into what I was learning on the coding stuff that I had been doing. So the compromise we made was that I could build a landing page in code and we'd build the app in Bubble. I know
I did not know
such a compromise. So I ended up building our landing page in React because that was what I was learning. And it was actually like a pretty decent landing page. I mean, it was definitely a template from Tailwind. It wasn't like I built it from scratch or anything like that, but I was able to customize. I knew enough about what I was doing. I had also used we had a CMS system that was, so like the rest of the team was able to like publish blog posts and things like that. Eventually, though, me being like the only person on the team who could update the landing page became a bottleneck, and I got too busy with Bubble, and we hired Kelly and all these things. Like it wasn't really a long-term sustainable thing for us to have this landing page be like on my GitHub and nobody else knows how to touch it. And so, yeah, we also wanted to redesign it anyway. So we took advantage of the opportunity to, we hired a design agency who built the actual designs and actually implemented it in Webflow as well. And yeah, that's in terms of the actual page. In terms of SEO, Kelly is working on an SEO project. I don't know if you want to talk about it, but
I mean, we're building out sort of a sync between Airtable that has a bunch of sort of ChatGPT kind of like SEO inspired content that we can then create pages in Webflow. I haven't started on it yet. I mean, we know what we're doing, but it's part of this cycle. So yeah, and the purpose of that is SEO. But I mean, that would just be, I wouldn't want to do that in Bubble.
Right. Before this project though, we had various different people working on this over the last 2 years. We had a different team member and a couple of contractors. I guess like V1 of our SEO strategy was just like more manual, like writing blog posts based on looking at keywords and trying to hit, rankings for them. I don't really know very much about SEO, as you can tell from how I'm talking about it, but I don't think it was specifically a Webflow thing. The Bubble app has always been on its own subdomain, which is like app.swapstack.co. And so when you click like get started or any of the buttons from the landing page, they just redirects you to Bubble. So they're not really connected.
Yeah, and the one thing I'll add is, Webflow is pretty optimized for SEO, and they work with a lot of really, really large companies on their blogs. And I think that's, one benefit is kind of outsourcing that, knowledge to them, let them take care of that optimization. And then most of SEO is then, the content, right, that you're putting on the page. And I know people do have success with Bubble as well, but I think there are certain things about Bubble, like page speed, which isn't going to be as good as Webflow. So just some things to kind of keep in mind. I think doing the subdomain is a good strategy to kind of optimize your SEO. A couple of questions about Bubble education resources. I'll just plug. This is a No Code MBA event, so I will plug go to No Code MBA and check out our Bubble course. I've been adding a lot of Bubble content lately, both. It's project based. So the newest course on strictly Bubble is how to build a Linktree clone. So you kind of go from zero to a fully functioning like SaaS app. So you'll learn everything that goes into working with Stripe and working with teams and all of the things that kind of go into the kind of basic building blocks of a SaaS app. There's also a lot of AI content now with Bubble connecting to different AI integrations, which can be really helpful and very hot right now for what people are interested in. So I'll also, there's obviously lots of other great resources out there for education that you can easily find, but I'll obviously plug No Code MBA there. Another one I'll quickly answer to kind of get out of the way. I think some people are asking about different ideas for profitable businesses or examples of businesses built on Bubble. So I'm going to just share a link in the chat that might be helpful. Our No Code MBA, there's a bunch of interviews, of which Swapstack has one as well, of different companies that are started with no code, so by founders. So that could be really helpful. I'm also going to share an article of ideas that could be different business ideas you can build without code. I'll also quickly respond to that, and I think Jake and Kelly might have some more thoughts on that. I think there's different ways you can kind of go about thinking about what type of business you want to start. You can do more of a I think one way to think about is what are larger SaaS companies that are have really big markets, and maybe you can take a small portion of that as like a bootstrapped entrepreneur. And that's kind of the path I took here with Conference Tap, which we're using right now. That's a really big market. I'm building a product with no code that I can build on my own and build a profitable business with it. You can also kind of go the path of more of a novel idea that doesn't really exist. And that's going to be more challenging in that you have to create the market, but you aren't competing with a bunch of other players. So I think it's good to think about what pain points do you have in your own life, and that's always a good way as well to kind of come up with different ideas. Maybe Jake and Kelly have some additional thoughts there on just the idea process.
Yeah, I think there are. So I think Seth's idea about I guess it kind of depends where you're at in terms of your skill set. I think if you're looking to still develop or learn how to build things, and we're talking about Bubble, so we can talk about Bubble kind of more specifically. I think if you're still learning Bubble, if you still, if you really want to, I guess if what you care about now is just like getting better at that, I think Seth's idea of like picking an app and just like cloning it, and maybe giving, just taking a tiny twist on it, and then maybe you can try selling it. I think that's a really good idea, because you might not succeed in selling it to anyone, but you'll at least have learned how to build in Bubble a little bit more. And so I think that's definitely valuable. The approach I took was to just do a lot of different projects, like just get out there and try a bunch of different things. And it wasn't expressly with the intention of like finding a startup idea, but that was, I knew a possibility that you just get out there, you work on projects, you meet people, you learn about what they're working on, and eventually, maybe an idea will smack you in the face. So that's what happened here. I think that's really good too. Like if you just increase your surface area and just expose yourself to lots of different things, lots of different problems, and I think eventually you'll be able to identify something.
I think also if you are able to somehow work with people who are doing it, like I did not realize when I came into Swapstack, I would like learn about how a startup gets built and how they think about product development and user interviews and all. I mean, just like so much stuff that I've learned just by kind of being around it. So if there's a way to do that, whether it's working for a company or like just making friends, like who are doing this stuff and then just asking them questions, you know?
Yeah, totally. I agree with both of those points as well. This question I think is interesting. It's for Kelly about, so the question is, I think you mentioned you knew HTML, CSS, and that without a design background, it could be a lot harder to get great at Bubble. Figma is super easy to manipulate designs, but without an HTML, CSS background, manipulating designs is a lot harder than Figma. So the question is, what advice do you have for a non-designer to get more foundation in designing in Bubble?
That's always the big question. I have so many thoughts about it, more thoughts than 2 minutes will allow. But I think one is copy what other people have done. Like that is not a crime. I mean, change the colors, don't like outright copy, but like practice building in Figma, which uses Flexbox, which is what Bubble is built on in terms of like the structure of containers. If you learn Figma and you learn how to use auto layout, you will be able to use Bubble's design system, right? So that's one thing, is there's a tie in there, which is like great. And Webflow also uses the same system. It looks different in all of these, but if you understand the concept, then you should be good. And then just rebuild stuff that other people have built. Practice it. Like rebuild Asana, rebuild Seth's this, right? It just like practice building stuff in Bubble, in Figma, and start looking at like, what is the consistency in terms of padding, in terms of color? Why is this button, red instead of outlined red? Like, and think about like what works and what doesn't. I think practicing and copying and stealing is the best way to learn design.
Yeah, I think
that's what I did. I didn't go to school for this. I'm a self-taught designer, and that's what I did.
Yeah, I think that's great and very actionable advice, and something that ties into a lot of things we talked about of if you in the beginning when we were saying, oh, if you don't know design, what do? You're not it's going to be harder to build a product. So it really is just practice and
practice.
Yeah, totally. Cool. So we are unfortunately out of time. There's a lot of other questions I would love to get to, but this was a really great and informative session. Hopefully you all got value out of it as well. I shared in the chat Kelly and Jake's Twitter. So feel free to click on those, follow them, maybe ask the question on Twitter if it didn't get answered here in the session, and hopefully you'll be able to get that answer there. One more thing I'll say is I know Jake and Kelly are planning a YouTube series or another series to talk more about their experience building a business in Bubble. So also, if you follow them on Twitter, you'll get all the updates there as well. Any other links or anything else you want to share on your side, Kelly or Jake?
Just shared the Swapstack Twitter.
I was about to say, if you happen to be either a publisher of a newsletter or a company represents a company who wants to explore advertising in newsletters, check us out.
Cool. Awesome. And if you want to learn Bubble, check out No Code MBA. And if you have any questions about building on Bubble, feel free to reach out to me. Happy to help. You can email me at seth@nocode.mba. All right. Thank you so much, Jake and Kelly, for joining. This was awesome. And I will be sharing the recording in a few days as well. It'll be posted on YouTube and emailed out to all of you who registered. So watch out for that, and see you at the next event. Thanks so much.
Bye.
Thank you, Seth.
Thanks, Seth.
All right. Bye.